Okay, everyone, as we get into project 3, we're going to talk about this concept of graphic translation, which is a process used to create logos. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, depending on the type of logo it is. In project 3, you're going to be creating an abstract symbol or an abstract mark that will work as a logo to represent a company or organization of your choice based on some parameters that we're working with, okay? So the process we'll talk about today to get to the end result of that abstract mark is called graphic translation, okay? So essentially, when we're looking at logos, what we're talking about, as you guys know, they're representative marks and symbols, okay? And they've been around for a lot longer than we may realize. Even as far back as ancient Greece, they've been found on Egyptian burial tombs. They've been used during the Middle Ages for different commercial aspects, always as ways to set, let's say, the tradesperson apart from the other tradesperson. Or, for example, when publishing became big, publishers had to distinguish themselves from each other when when the early printing press was happening. Here you see some potter's marks. So again, a lot of craftspeople would use their own identifying mark, oftentimes at the bottom of, say, in this case, of some sort of terracotta lamp. It says here. We see some modular stone cutters marks here. The literal brands or branding elements taken from cattle branding. So those are basically representative symbols as well. And again, here some other options here. These German marks from 15th, 16th century, French silk merchant's mark from the late 18th century, etc. Okay, it should be this one here. Again, here just some more examples. You see as far back as 1457, as we mentioned with the invention of the printing press. Again, you had to set publishers apart from each other, and so they would have or printers would also have their own marks, and so they would basically use those to represent their printing company. This is 1700s era, basically a porcelain company from France. Various iterations of the evolution of their identifying marks, and one that we still see in use today, ABC. It's still around, and it was designed in the late 40s, if you can believe that. Okay, with the typeface is from the Bauhaus actually, and this was done by Paul Rand, and we'll talk a little more about him. He's done a lot of iconic marks through the years, and many of which are still in existence today, many years later, which is one of the criteria for a good mark or logo. Which is getting into that, we tend to overuse that word the logo. Or I guess we use it as a blanket term, okay? And all we're talking about is something that signifies a company in a distinctive way, or some sort of object, a publication, whatever it is. Even people, as we know, people have their own brands now, and depending on the context we're talking about, there are many different types of logos. Here are a few. And what we're going to be focused on here is this type of mark. But to start, you have what are called word marks, often called logotypes as well, and sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And as you can see, a logotype is essentially spelling out the name of the company. Obviously, one of the benefits there is you know what it is right away. You're not guessing at anything. There's no abstraction necessarily. It says what it is, and hopefully it's done so in a way that's somewhat unique, or at least applied with a color palette, or used in a way that makes it stand out. It's interesting because many things, especially very neutral types of brands, like say Pottery, or not Pottery Bar, but maybe Crate and Barrel. That's just Helvetica, black Helvetica on white. And so really they're all about the products they offer. So the identity takes a backseat to their whole product line, which is varied and very colorful and all that. So that neutral pattern of a very basic letter mark or word mark makes sense. Here we have a couple abstract symbols for Time Warner and for Chase Bank. These are either called letter marks or monograms. You'll see them used, that term used as well. And essentially, and I'll post this PDF for you guys to have as your reference, so you can go back through here and read all of these, okay? But as we talked about with word marks, there are some advantages. Obviously, you read it. It is what it is. It can be like very generic, like we talked about, possibly. The advantage of a symbol is it's really, I mean, you're distilling the essence of an organization or company down to the most, minimal component possible, and it also can be very unique. The concern there is that, does it stand on its own and signify? Does it have a life without needing anything else? Say, for example, the name of the company. Okay, is it going to be able to be recognized? Usually, it can be, but that's after years and years of use. Okay. Um, Not always, and today now more than ever we're seeing abstract symbols used in ways that even new companies they get to be known pretty quickly because the proliferation of information is so rampant now just due to social platforms. And again, the monogram here, just using initials typically to serve the purpose of the identity, the mark. So this is Paul Rand here, and these are some points he made about logos. He said basically a logo is a flag, a signature, and a scutcheon. And a scutcheon is like an emblem, like a shield type of emblem oftentimes. He says it doesn't sell directly, it identifies. Yeah, that's true typically, although I don't know. I think the logos are, especially in brand contexts, oftentimes the logo is a big part of why things sell. So I think there's some gray area there, and rarely is a logo a literal description of a business. That is very true. I mean, if you get the two most typical examples, we always talk about Apple and say Target. I mean, those don't necessarily directly indicate the product or the how the business goes about doing business, but they are connected to meaning in some way that's founded in the maybe the ethos of the business or some sort of background or some sort of strategic decision. It derives its meaning from the quality of the thing it symbolizes and not the other way around. I think there's some truth there, meaning, okay, if you have the greatest logo possible applied to the worst company ever or the worst product, the logo is not going to live unless it might live in infamy, but it will not last. Okay, so on its own, it can't do all the work, essentially, okay? So with that, it's less important than the product it signifies. And it's, this idea of what it means is more important than what it looks like. I don't know, I'll leave that to you. Do you agree? I'm putting these here as, these are his, it's parts of his perspective. Are they, do I totally 100% agree with them or not? I think ideally what we do is have a conversation here about this. And hear what you guys think. So an effective mark depends on, distinctiveness helps, right? So it needs to set itself apart from the rest of the pack in its industry or in its marketplace. Obviously, visibility is important. How does it work across a variety of media? We've talked about this. Does it work from a business card to maybe sometimes on the side of an airplane and everything in between? And with that, usability is a big part of that. How easy is it to use and apply? Memorable is obviously huge, and that's often gained, like we said, over time. But in the beginning, as we'll see, sometimes you have to add a little, so for example, in a company with an abstract symbol, maybe it's going to have some type with it that signifies a name, and over the years you can get rid of that name and just have the symbol. So we see that a lot. Ideally, if the business is global or works beyond a small sphere, it has to be universally understood or able to be applied universally. And durability, it means it lasts. Okay, so with that timelessness, it's important too. So these logos here again are connecting to the Paul Rand thing. These are all done by Paul Rand. IBM, this same basic lettermark here or monogram is still in play, even though the stripes might be gone. The Westinghouse logo as it stands here has been around and still exists. If you go to the Westinghouse website, you'll find this mark. ABC, we know the story there, same thing. UPS only recently changed. It had been around for many, many years and changed, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, if that. And the next logo, that was one of Steve Jobs' computer companies between his two stints at Apple. So that's defunct because the company's gone. This is just a few more points here. You can read through these, but essentially there's some overlap from what we just talked about, but also this idea of creating a focus internally is important. Whenever you have a group, a company, or some sort of organization with multiple people and multiple levels of hierarchy, it enables everyone to get behind something that's sort of a I guess I'll say unilateral identifier, um, that everyone can, a universal identifier that everyone can get behind. Maybe that makes more sense. And with that, there's some clear identity there. And it does enable an audience to form a personal relationship with whatever the product or service is. I think that's very true. I think people even start to, become, logos can become, branding can be tribal in a way. If you think about subgroups and subcultures and different, in surf culture, music culture, skate culture, what fashion, high fashion, whatever it is, there's almost this sort of group dynamic behind a label or a brand or a logo, essentially. And they can bring order to chaos, essentially pulling all those components of an organization or business together and unifying them to communicate clearly. Okay. So, for example, I mean, like we'll always talk about Apple when it comes to branding or logos. Why did they pick an apple? How does it relate to their product? And why take a bite out of it? You guys may know this. I wish we could have right now a discussion about it. But essentially, I mean, in terms of why the name, yeah, it clearly doesn't connect to computers directly. I mean, there's in the Steve Jobs biography, sort of the official one, he talked about it being connected to his stint as a fruitarian. So were times when he only ate fruit. As you know, Jobs had and Wozniak both, the founders had they were hippie-ish in the late 60s into the 70s. And so there's, some people also talk about it as connected to the idea of Isaac Newton and knowledge and education. So there are, a lot of ideas about it. But, how does it relate directly to a computer? It doesn't necessarily. It's more about the ethos of the company founders and what it could stand for beyond just the product itself. And in terms of taking a bite out of it, I've heard this idea, if you take the word byte and you change the I for the Y, for a byte you have a digital unit that directly relates to the product itself. So maybe there's a bit of humor and a nod to that idea of a byte, as a digital element there. And you can see the evolution of the logo here from the earliest iteration, which again is very hippie-ish in its mid-70s application. And as you can see, obviously very hard to reproduce, very hard to read, and not going to be applicable across a variety of media. You see the basic logo since '77 has been in play with different sort of an evolution tour where it's gone actually simpler over the years. The most current example is definitely flatter. When I was, some of the first Macs I bought were kind of the late 90s into early 2000s. You could see the change. My first computer was beige and it had this logo on it, and then pretty soon you have these sort of very late 90s, early 2000s, dimensionality happening. And then we're back to this sort of more minimal approach. But again, Apple is recognizable. It's universal. And it's at this point it is memorable, and it's even something again that people get behind as an identifier for their preferences. Some people are heavy Apple people, some people are more Microsoft Windows people. It's cost effective. It's definitely stood the test of time, and it will be here for many years. So let's talk about a few techniques in creating abstract marks. This is down to graphic translation, which is what we were talking about. We're going to move pretty quickly here so this video doesn't get too ridiculously long. Again, this will be here for your reference, posted in Canvas. So essentially, graphic translation is we're taking something and we're abstracting it and simplifying it and stylizing it into a cohesive symbol or mark, okay, that is recognizable and representative somehow of the original object without being as detailed. So for example, here we see a maple tree, okay, with beautiful red leaves. And if we were going to take a logo and start to take an image like this, which is one of the things you're going to do for your project, taking this image and making it into a logo, what would I do? Okay, so if you look at these, okay, these are all abstracted leaves, okay, and you can see there are many different ways to draw a leaf, okay. That said, are any of these going to be an effective symbol? I would probably say no. I mean, some of them are pretty cool looking. Some of them are, most of them are probably too thin. Some of them have detail where detail is not necessary. Some of them are so abstracted as to be maybe unrecognizable, in particular this, or maybe something like this. But they're also too open from a Gestalt standpoint, as we've talked about. There's no cohesive weight to them. They're very light and they would not reduce well. Okay, so yes, these are basically graphically translated leaves, but they are not necessarily suitable for a symbol or a mark, okay, or a logo, for example. And so when we talk about context, that's going to definitely determine how we got to consider designing this element, okay? Because again, if it's going to be an illustration, like one of these, that's fine. But if it's going to be a mark that's applied across a variety of contexts, we need to be able to work with something that's going to, obviously be representative, but also has the legs to work across a variety of media, okay? So if we're talking about leaves, let's talk about the flag of Canada. You guys, as one of your exercises, researched and watched a video on state flags. And there's some interesting information on color choices and symbols and the do's and don'ts of flag design. I think the flag of Canada design is one of the definite do's. I mean, it's simple enough, it's bold, it's striking graphically, and it doesn't have any more information than it needs. It doesn't have a sort of, a lot of typer on it or some sort of seal as you often see. It has this just very basically graphically translated version of a maple leaf, which if you get into why they worked with a maple leaf, it's found throughout the Canadian landscape, used by indigenous peoples well before the presence of European settlers. It's been a symbol to represent Canada since the 18th century, but this has only been in use since the mid-60s, which is interesting. In terms of red and white, there's a long history of that color palette used throughout Canada. And it's essentially, they're talking about this color white being reflective of impartiality, of also kind of connecting to peace and tranquility, while red is this idea of prosperity and dynamism and hope. Okay, and then when you get to the flag design, you'll notice this maple leaf here. The amount of points aren't necessarily significant. So we're not trying to distill every single component of a symbol down to mean something. In this case, there's practicality that's involved too. And essentially when they did tests to see when this thing was used in wind, which symbol would be the least blurry at high speeds especially, or if it's flying or moving in the wind, they came up with this design. So whenever we're dealing with a symbol design, we have to deal with meaning and abstraction and application and timelessness, but also practicality. Is it just going to work given the many contexts it might be found in? Okay. A little note on color here. This is familiar to you guys after Project 2. You can see that there are different reds selected for the Canadian flag based on whether it's in print, whether it's on an actual fabric flag, or if it's on the a Canadian website, or anything, a T-shirt, okay, for example. You'll see the different color modes here, which are pretty consistent, but a little bit of variation, okay? But those are the official reds they'll use. Another example here of an identity that, if we talk about its earliest origins, shell oil, you look at the earliest logo here, it's literally a shell. And not necessarily a very interesting or descriptive one. It looks like someone's cousin drew it, which is fine, but would that last for years? No. And as you see the change from even just in 4 years from 1900 to 1904, you start to see this, the basic foundation of the shell logo today, just with much more detail. Again, hard to reproduce. These kinds of things, as you see, especially once they get smaller, the darker areas, all these different heavy black areas, they just become, a blur. Okay, so you can see even as early as 1930, a little bit of cleanup and some stylization happening there. This is a very 30s era style, this very deco kind of feel. And you get into the late 40s and the early 50s, and we're starting to see the origins of the modern version of shell, but still containing that name in there. Okay, and this is 61 years later, still containing the name, so people are aware of what it is. Okay, ultimately, after 1999, as you got into from 2000 on, the name was ditched altogether. And this is basically what you have representing that company, which, as you can see, is very simple. Okay, this is not a complex shape. It's not a difficult logo to create technically at all, but is it meaningful, and does it work, and is it stable, and is it timeless? Yes. And if you look at a Shell station in the late 40s, early 50s, this is what you would see. You can see this Shell, 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 all this, even the pumps all have the name on it, okay? And so it's everywhere. As you've progressed and that brand has become more and more known, you see a station from today, and the only place you're going to see it really here is in, when it's talking about the product, the different products. Otherwise, it's going to be the mark by itself and pretty much nothing else. Okay, other than the color palette, which we know is a huge signifier for that brand. Especially if you're on a trip and you take an exit off the highway and you see many different gas stations. I don't know if anyone has any brand loyalty. I certainly don't with the petroleum company. I usually want the cheapest gas. Okay. A few different processes or techniques to work on creating abstract marks. This idea of simplification, abstraction, and stylization. Okay, so obviously simplification is what it says. It just takes an object and makes it easier to understand and recognize by pulling away anything that is unnecessary. Okay. Abstraction is, again, same thing, reducing something down to its most basic form, which doesn't mean it's always going to be directly, a one-to-one comparison of the actual thing that it's representing, not just the company, but the actual object itself. So like we said with that leaf, that the Canadian flag is an abstracted leaf symbol. It's not directly, representative of the leaf itself. And with that, some stylization. So now this is where you have to be careful, because stylization can be interesting depending, and we looked at that shell symbol. Let's go back here. This one here from 1930, this is very stylized, like we said, and connected to the era, okay? Which, can make sense, but, also has a shorter shelf life typically, because stylization is typically rooted in specific styles of arrows, and with that, you might, as things evolve and styles change, you might not have the ability to evolve the brand without having to change it significantly. So some illustrations here, just to illustrate those points. If we take this idea of this little insect here, this is realistic, semi-realistic. It starts to be simplified. It gets decorative here. And again, a few different decorative examples here, and essentially that's just this very flat graphic could be sort of a mid-century element. A mid-century sort of very flat graphic style compared to something like this decorative, almost more like we just said deco illustration style. Okay, so these are sort of stylized versions. Okay, and with that, again, also stylized this idea of this symbolic representation of this creature. Okay, so you go from realistic to semi-realistic, some decorative options, a more symbolic, again, very simple, very geometric, and even further minimized and refined to the point of total abstraction here, where it's is it even identifiable? This is an extreme case, but it just shows you, to illustrate the idea of starting here and ending up here as an abstract component. And things do in logo designs get that abstract. There will be a nod, and obviously, could this thing work by itself completely? Probably not. It would probably need a name of a company, at least in the early stages. Okay, or would it even be appropriate for a logo at all? That's a good question. How much information do you need to identify a bird? Even looking here, I'm no expert in birds. I would assume that's a cardinal. Just based on what I know of the cardinal and this really basic shape, very geometric and minimal color palette applied. Okay, some of you might be bird people and know these types. This is about the extent of my knowledge with birds. So again, what do you need to have to be able to convey what you're trying to represent? The eye is probably the most overused visual element. Well, maybe it's the light bulb, but who knows? The eye is a close second. But again, just from the idea of a photograph, very straight photorealistic, same image here, just more posterized and graphically applied, but still far too involved to be a mark or a logo. This is a version of the eye from the times of Egypt, the ancient, or the Eye of Horus. This is meant to represent protection, etc. You have sort of goofy, the idea of eyes. I guess there are 3 eyes there. If there's a brand that has some sort of connection to that, that'd be, potentially applicable. and then the most sort of, kind of current minimal graphic representation of, I should say, translation of this original object. Okay, so this is, again, if we're taking the picture of something and essentially translating it into an abstract mark, that's the foundation of your project 3. Okay, just so you know. This is interesting to see. This is some more work from Paul Rand. Whenever he would present a new logo for a client, he would make these full-on books. He would present these books that had all the foundational research and information in them. And this was designed in the late 60s for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which nowadays would be called the Bureau of Native American Affairs, I'm sure. I should look and see before I say that, but I would assume that would be the case. If you look at some background information here, these are really interesting to read. And again, you'll have this PDF, so I highly suggest going through here and checking this out. He says, obviously, a symbol in and of itself cannot accomplish objectives. However, it can reflect, symbolically the spirit of an organization or program. So the elements that he chose to use, and again, you can see, extremely simple, not difficult on a technical level, but it has to have the meaning and it has to have the reason, why behind it. So the elements comprising this symbol here, he picked the sun, the arrow, and the star, and he tells you why here. The sun, life-giving force. The circle itself, which is also connected to it, is unity. And the native progress, aspiration, optimism. Okay, again, this was late 60s, and so did that pan out? We don't know. Or I guess we do know. It's probably a mixed bag there, but. And then American patriotism and hope using the star. And combining all those elements here, this is the abstract mark that was used, okay, and applied as an identity, okay? So, he gives you all the background as to why this was done. And so there's some interesting reading there if you're interested. But again, you can see through research, taking those component parts and then putting them together. So this isn't just like we talked about before, 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. Okay, it's adding all those ideas together to create new meaning. Okay. Talking about a few more techniques, I want to talk about some actual processes to use or some ways to think about approaching the mark. One of them is this idea of addition or insertion, okay, where you're taking two items like we just showed in that Paul Rand logo and pushing them together to create new meaning. Okay, so again, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts here. This is something that we did for an artisan tea company called Halcyon, and that name is one of the genus of a kingfisher, when there are many different types of kingfisher, the bird, which seems to be a theme here in this lecture, birds. But the other thing to think about is the fact that in a tea situation, the plucking standard for high quality tea is 2 leaves and an unopened young bud here, as you can see. And so that was considered as an interesting foundational visual element, as was obviously the bird itself, which had to make an appearance. And this was the combined, after many iterations, which I have a whole case study of and I can share with you if you're interested. This is what ended up being the final mark. Okay, and like I said, there are other elements that can be shown from that identity if you guys are interested in seeing a case study about that, and I can walk through that. But this was essentially the idea of taking this element, translating this element, as well as translating this, and then working with them together, adding them together to create something new. Okay, which is that idea of addition or insertion. Substitution is another approach where you're essentially taking something familiar and you're replacing it with something that connects to the brand or company or organization. So in this case, Colossal Pictures, we know there's film involved. The idea of the Colosseum, the Roman Colosseum, is replaced with the film, and you get those familiar object that's being represented but in a new way. Okay, so that's substituting elements for other elements. Warner Music Nashville, you see the W, Warner, and then M for music, and then those 2 strokes here create the N, so Warner Music Nashville, and then you have the musical notes added there. So pretty clever, okay? A nice kind of monogram situation. And then you have this deer element with some, instead of the antlers, you have the snowflakes substituted in place, okay? Omission or abstraction, I'm sorry, subtraction, taking something out of shape typically. So in this Whaling Museum logo, you have the sails of the ship, and you have the whale tail there employed in a way that makes sense. And then it's applied with some type. This is a very open logo. It's somewhat tricky. I wonder how small it can go, but as it works for a museum, it probably looks good on a tote bag or a shirt, etc. You got to be careful here because things can get very style driven very quickly. And so you just got to be careful of not letting a specific style or wanting to start with a style, letting that drive your decisions. It's got to be really about what represents whatever it is you're trying to represent. Something like this, I mean, you can see this is essentially a rounded rectangle up top with 90-degree edges on the bottom, corners on the bottom, and it's just these little squares or rectangles omitted, and this almost like flag shape omitted, and the circle omitted to create this Elephant and Castle shopping center. Okay. Interesting. That's an actual logo. Okay. One of the last things to remember is we've talked about Gestalt. Some of you guys presented about Gestalt, and it's a crucial element in logo design. Okay, so when you're thinking about proximity, whatever the elements you are using, they have to feel unified together, whole. Okay, so that idea of proximity is very important. You don't want to have different elements going in different directions, feeling like a bunch of separate things. Like we saw in the Paul Rand logo with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you had 3 separate elements but combined to be one. And as you also noticed, there was in that logo, like many others, space, the white space was flowing through the logo. You don't want to trap your logo necessarily. You don't want to trap the the negative space. You want it to flow from the bottom versus being locked in place. There's some good visual movement happening and flow, which is pleasing to the eye. Okay, it feels good. Similarity is good. I'm using similar shapes and repeated here. You have that, and then you have this idea like we just talked about of subtraction. You have these repeated shapes here to create the feathers. You subtract this little divot here, and you essentially have the peacock logo, okay, which is interesting. Continuation, obviously, movement in a specific direction can be helpful if that's important. Figure ground, playing with the positive negative space, which really many of these are doing here. Another Gestalt principle that's important that you do not want to forget about in your mark development. Okay, so just quickly, your Project 3 overview, what you're going to do is you're going to select an object or an image, okay, one or more. So for example, we talked about the Canadian flag. That first image was the image of the leaf. We looked at the image of the photo of the eye and all the possible distillations of that, the translations of that to create more of an abstract mark. You're going to take the image that you select and you're going to simplify it, all the visual elements to the most key components there, okay? And then you're going to abstract it to reveal its essential meaning, all right? So we looked at a bunch of examples of what that means just now. So your goal here is to distill an abstract idea into a meaningful visual mark that will essentially work as a logo for an entity. So for entity, that's connecting to these things here. That's got to be connected to these industries, we'll say, okay, in these focus areas here. So, and originally I was going to say that the entity doesn't have to have a name, but I do want you guys actually to create a name for it as well. I think that's just much easier to get your head around than it is trying to just create a mark for something that doesn't have a name to it. So I want you to name whatever it is that you're making. And if the name finds its way into the logo design, that's fine, but it doesn't have to. But I do want you to have a name for the organization, the entity that you're designing for. So it can relate to something in travel and tourism, art and culture. Travel and tourism, travel companies, airlines, anything that relates to that world, hotels, etc. Arts and culture, I don't know, museums, art organizations, maybe even art schools. Okay, I mean that could be education as well, but it could work. Food and beverages, many cafes, restaurants, drink brands, etc. Nature and outdoors. I mean examples would be Patagonia, REI, etc. Technology and communications, computer companies. I know a lot of you like gaming. It could be a gaming company, but not one that exists. It'd have to be something that you make up. And then security and protection. I mean, that can go from anywhere from physical security to digital security, computer security companies, etc. Okay, those are the industries you want to pick from. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get into finding out what that organization is going to be. and you'll be able to find out some more information in the project overview, which is here, but I will not get into this in this video here because it's already getting too long. I'll do a separate video, or I'll just have you guys give me some questions as if you read through this and then need any more info. Okay, that's it for this now. And